All right, so we're coming to the conclusion of Sefer Bamidbar, and this week we actually have two Parshiot, Matot and Mas'ei, right? And Matot and Mas'ei, it's actually appropriate that we do them together because they close out the book of Bamidbar. You know, one of the reasons that the alternative name for Bamidbar is Sefer HaPikudim, right, which in English ends up translating into the book of Numbers, is because it's basically framed between a census and a census. Okay, we have a census in Parshat Bamidbar, right, when we begin our wilderness journeys, and then we have another census in Parshat Pinḥas, last week's Parsha, right? And you can see in the comparison of these two, the first census with the last census, that certain tribes developed in a very healthy, productive way, and certain tribes didn't, right? And that's pretty much expressed by the tribes whose numbers go up versus the tribes whose numbers go down, right? Basically, the tribes whose numbers go up, we say that they had a very healthy internal tribal development during the 4 decades of life in the wilderness, and the tribes whose numbers went down, we say that they had some more challenges that they need to figure out how to overcome. And now that we're past the second census, we're really gearing up for the entry into and liberation of the land. Okay, and we see some, basically Matot deals with some of our external corrections that need to take place before we're ready to conquer the land, and Mas'ei deals more with the internal. Okay, so the first thing we see is Vaydeber Moshe el Roshei Hamatot Livnei Yisrael, without it saying Vaydeber HaShem el Moshe lemor, right? This is basically rare, but what it's showing us already at the very beginning of Parshat Matot is that Moshe has developed to the point of acquiring some level of independence. Right? You see, Moshe being on the high level of Nivuah, or beyond Nivuah, according to the Rambam, right? That he enjoys, he essentially lacks independence, meaning the more, it's not that he lacks independence, it's that the more aware someone is of the reality of the universe, the less free will we could say they have to do other than the divine plan, right? Like if we were totally conscious of the impact our mitzvot have on the universe and on ourselves and on the people around us, and also our averot, chas v'shalom, then it'd be very easy to live totally in line with halakha, because we would see, or we would maybe not see, but sense with some sense that we're not yet using properly, the ramifications, the immediate ramifications of our actions, of our thoughts, of our speech, right, on the world around us, on our own souls, on creation, right? And the more aware we are, the less free will we experience to do other, right? So Moshe, being on the high level of prophecy that he's on, and enjoying that higher vision and higher awareness of how the world operates, there's a certain lack of independence, we can say, through most of his career, right? That he just is a vessel, and which is good in a sense. It means that he was a perfect vessel to bring the Torah into the world, right? He's like a clear pipe, right, without the ego. That's what we mean when we call him a Bal Anava, that we refer to Moshe as having incredible humility. We don't mean that he had low self-esteem, right? He didn't have an inferiority complex. On the one hand, our sages referred to Moshe as being the most humble human who's ever lived. On the other hand, as soon as the Torah introduces him to us, we see 3 incidents, right? In Parshat Shmot, we see 3 incidents where Moshe proactively intervenes in the conflicts of others. And in two of these cases, violently. So we're not talking about a person who lacks self-esteem. We're talking about a person who actually has the self-confidence of a king and received the education of a pharaoh growing up. Right? He was educated, he was bred to potentially be the leader of the most powerful empire at the time. So this isn't somebody with low self-esteem, but it's somebody who's able to put the character he plays aside to the extent that he's able to be a perfect pipe for the Torah to come into our world. Okay? And here we see that he's, instead of waiting for the download and giving it over to the nation, he's finding it inside himself, which is very important because we're soon going to get to the book of Devarim, which is essentially Sefer Moshe. Right? We should understand Sefer Devarim as being on a slightly different level of Nivuah than the 4 books of the Torah that came before. But it's basically Sefer Moshe. It's Moshe's prophetic message to us, but a prophecy he finds inside himself. Okay, and that's what he's doing here already. He's finding that divine revelation inside himself. And he has the confidence to do it, he has the independence to do it. And that's, for Moshe, a sense of growth. Now, in the last Parsha, in Parshat Pinḥas, following the incident where Midian and Moav and Bilaam conspired against us and sent women to seduce us and cause, litzarenu, many of us to fall, both in terms of sexual sin and also in terms of idolatry, right, which led to a plague of 24,000 being killed, and Pinḥas ultimately stops the plague and makes peace between Israel and HaShem by killing Zimri and Cosbi, Zimri being the tribal chief of Shimon and Cosbi being the Midian princess, right, who were having relations in front of the Israelite camp. Right, Pinḥas kills them and basically earns for himself the Kehuna. He becomes a Kohen, and not only a Kohen, but essentially we're taught that he lives forever. Later we know him as Eliyahu Navi. He has what's called the Brit Shalom, right? He's a pursuer of Shalom, and Shalom, sometimes it's translated into English as peace. Shalom doesn't necessarily mean peace. Certainly not the Western conception of peace, which is basically the lack of conflict. Right? When you think about the word peace in Western civilization in the English language, it basically means non-violence, non-conflict. But what shalom means in Hebrew is shlemut. It's like completeness. The world as it should be, right? The world functioning according to its highest ideal. And so Pinḥas is a rodef shalom, and he earns the Brit Shalom, the covenant of Shalom, by identifying the obstacles to Shalom in the world and eliminating those obstacles. Right? That is a way to pursue Shalom. Right? To identify the obstacles to Shalom, to the divine ideal being manifest in the world, and eliminating those obstacles. Right? Now, at that time, HaShem gives Moshe this mitzvah for Am Yisrael, like tzaror etem Midianim v'kitem otam, right? Tzaror is kind of in like the permanent sense, to like harass, to identify Midian as an enemy nation with an enemy worldview, etc., which is important because clearly Israel had a specific kind of temptation when it came to Midian. V'kitem otam, like to attack them, to kill them, to fight them in war. Okay, but we don't fight them right away. We fight them now. We fight them in Parshat Matot, right? And it's very interesting because Hashem says to Moshe, "Nekom nikmat b'nei Yisrael me'et Midyanim, achar te'asef el amecha." Okay. Now, first of all, this te'asef al amecha el amecha. How do we understand that? Like you'll be gathered to your people, right? That's one of the ways of understanding that. That meaning it's a euphemism for death. That this is the last mitzvah that Moshe is commanded to do, and he's instructed specifically that after this, he's going to leave the world. And he still rushes to do it. That's one understanding, and a true understanding, but there's another way we could look at this also. Tasef el Amecha, he'll really finally become part of his people. Because Midian, in Moshe's experience, right, in Moshe's development, Midian occupied a specific role. Midian was the alternative to Israel for Moshe. When Moshe had attempted to start a slave revolt in Egypt and it didn't work out, the Hebrews didn't fight, and in fact they threatened to turn him in. Moshe fled, right? He fled Egypt, and he goes to Midian, Midian being a son of Avraham Avinu, right? One of the later sons of Avraham with Keturah later in life, and Moshe attempts to create a new Hebrew nation to replace Israel, because Israel are such slaves that Moshe does not see Israel as capable of fulfilling the mission of the Hebrews. And he marries the daughter of Yitro, who was a spiritual leader in Midian, who ultimately rejects idolatry and becomes a dugumai. There's machloket whether Yitro became a Noachide or a Ger Toshav. For me, it seems pretty clear that he becomes a Noachide, and really the Noachide par excellence, like the best example that the Torah is showing us of the Noachide, right? Someone who is on our mission, allied to us without becoming one of us, right? And his descendants become the Kenim, who are living with us in the land of Israel. Many of whom are living with us in the land of Israel, and are our allies in the times of the judges and in the times of Shaul HaMelech, certainly, right? There's a moment where Shaul attacks Amalek, and the Amalekites are living together with the Kenim, and Shaul tells the Kenim, get out of the way, right? We don't want to hurt you, you're our friends, so get out of the way so we don't hurt you, because we're attacking Amalek. Now, Moshe tries to create this alternative to Israel, this other Hebrew nation with Midian, and HaShem coerces him at the burning bush to go and liberate Israel. That it has to be Israel. And Moshe ultimately comes to this realization internally. He ultimately comes to understand this when he gets to know Israel a little bit better, right? He has to go back to Egypt, and he liberates Israel, and he spends 4 decades with them in the wilderness. But even before 4 decades, like early on in their journey, there were 2 incidents in which Hashem basically told Moshe, okay, I'm going to wipe them out and start again with you, which is what Moshe had planned by creating a nation with Midian. And both times here, both in the incident of the golden calf and in the incident of the spies, Moshe rejects this plan, meaning Moshe had by that time already internalized that it needs to be Israel, that the divine plan needs to come about through Am Yisrael, through the biological descendants of Yaakov, of Israel. But still, because Midian had occupied a certain place in Moshe's journey, to really become part of Israel, Moshe needs to go to war with Midian. Like, this is important for him to actually become part of Israel in a sense, fully. He has to go to war with Midian. And this is difficult. And you're going to see this because after the war, he's going to lose his temper. And generally, anger results when we're feeling a type of internal conflict. We'll visit that in a moment. I just want to also point out that when Moshe goes, what Hashem had said to Moshe was take vengeance, right? Nikmat b'nei Israel. Take the vengeance of Israel. Right? Avenge the vengeance of Israel. Okay? Against the Midianim. And Moshe turns around to the nation and he describes what they're going to do as Nikmat HaShem b'Midian. We're going to take Hashem's vengeance against Midian. So there's a question here. Why is Moshe changing the mitzvah? If Hashem told Moshe to take vengeance for Israel, why does Moshe turn around to Israel and say we're going to take vengeance for Hashem? And according to Rashi, the vengeance of Israel is the vengeance of HaShem. When a nation attacks Israel, they're essentially attacking HaShem. They're essentially attacking the Creator and His plan for the world. And we regard the enemies of Israel as the enemies of the Kadosh Baruch Hu. This is sometimes difficult because there might be people who have a good reason to dislike us. Maybe we do something wrong. We've done things wrong before, right? Maybe we've mistreated other people. Right? So if we've, by the way, we don't go after Moav here. We don't go after Moav because one of the reasons we don't go after Moav is because Moav had a legitimate reason to want to defend themselves from us. They were acting in self-defense, or what they perceived to be self-defense. We actually weren't going to attack them. But that's one explanation, that Moav had a legitimate reason to fear Israel and therefore acted in self-defense, and we don't go after them. Midian, however, was clearly motivated by a hatred for Israel and a desire to stop us from fulfilling our mission, and they came from elsewhere. And another understanding, by the way, is that Moav is a vassal, is a proxy of Midian. And because the conflict is really one between Israel and Midian, we attack Midian directly and not the proxies. Right? Which also teaches us lessons that might be relevant for today. Now, Bilaam is also part of this. Remember, Midian and Bilaam we have a similar relationship with. Because Bilaam is according to Chazal, the descendant of Nahor. Right? Nahor being the brother of Avraham, meaning Bilaam is a Hebrew. Bilaam is a prophet of the nations. Bilaam is the result, really, of Nahor's plan being successful. Nahor believed that the way to achieve the Hebrew mission is to live among the most enlightened Gentile societies, like Aram, and to spread Torah and knowledge of HaShem in these enlightened cosmopolitan centers. And Bilaam essentially did that. Bilaam was a successful prophet amongst the nations, respected by world leaders, spreading Torah, teaching Torah, bringing humanity close to HaShem, and but feels threatened by Israel. We should also notice something, that even though Nahor was an Ivri, when the Torah describes Lavan and Bilaam, we're basically shown that they're Aramim, meaning that there's some level of assimilation that takes place, some loss of identity that takes place, some watering down of the Hebrew identity. Even though we're going to say they're Hebrews, biologically they're Hebrews. And they're even, to a certain extent, on the Hebrew mission. They're ideologically Hebrews. But something got watered down. They not only influenced Aram, but were influenced by Aram. So Midian might have a very similar ideological conflict with Israel as Bilaam. Okay? And so now we're commanded to go to war. The vengeance of Israel is understood as the vengeance of HaShem. And Moshe is told that he, through this act, we could say either through this act he will truly become part of his people, or this is the last major thing he's going to do and then he's going to leave the world, or both. Right? Often when there's different interpretations of things that the Torah is showing us, it's both. And so we go to war, and we decimate Midian. Clearly not all the Midianites, because there are Midianites that appear later in Sefer Shoftim. Right? We have conflicts with Midian in Sefer Shoftim. So there are Midianim left. We didn't attack all the Midianim, but we attacked the ones who were who had basically the camp of Midian that had perpetrated the evil against us. and we killed their royal council, whatever, the elders of Midian, right? And we killed Bilaam, right? The war is led by Pinḥas on the battlefield. He's in Meshua Melchama. He's the war priest, right? And there are a lot of spoils. And Moshe gets angry. Moshe gets angry that we took prisoners. Now, why is he getting angry? He didn't clarify the law in advance that we have to kill everybody. Right? He didn't say kill children. He didn't say kill the women. There is no divine instruction. We're told to take vengeance. And we did a great job on the battlefield. And we basically wiped out Midian, but we took, women and children as captives, as part of the spoils. Right? By the way, later in the Torah, in Parshat Kititze, we'll get the halachic framework, the process for how Hebrew soldiers can take enemy women in battle. Like what that process is and what it ultimately means. But Moshe basically gets angry that we took all these prisoners, which means there's something going on internally, that Moshe is experiencing some kind of discomfort with this war. He's doing it. HaShem commanded him. He understands it's right. But there's something that's bothering him, to the point that he actually forgets to mention the halacha in regards to cleansing the utensils, right, the metal utensils. And Elazar HaKohen, the son of Aaron, comes and clarifies it. He basically tells us what the halacha is there, and he says it in the name of Moshe, meaning this is the halacha that Moshe taught, even though Moshe at the moment had forgotten it due to his anger. The next major event that we see taking place is the tribes of Gad and Reuven requesting land east of the Jordan River. Now the question is this a good thing or a bad thing? The Torah originally presents it to us, by the way, as Reuven and Gad, because Reuven is the older son of Yaakov. But from then on, it's pretty much Gad and Reuven, because Gad is the more aggressive partner, let's say, in asking for these lands. They want land that we've already conquered, east of the Jordan River, right? The territories we took from Sichon and Og. Gad and Reuven want these as their tribal territory. And at first Moshe is very upset, because he sees it as like a rejection of the mitzvah to liberate the land, to cross the Jordan, come into Eretz Canaan. And also as, wait a minute, he says, maybe this is also relevant to some of the things going on in Israeli society today. He asks, you're going to sit here while your brothers go to war? Meaning it's not fair. The land you want was conquered by all of Israel. And you're going to get that and not participate in the liberation of the land west of the Jordan? So they come to a clarification, right? They come to an accommodation. They come to some kind of, basically they say, no, we're going to go in the front. We're going to be the shock troops. And God was according to our sages, God was the best fighters in Israel. Most of our generals apparently came from God. They had a unique fighting style where they would take off the head and right arm of an enemy in one strike. God was known as the warrior tribe. That doesn't mean that they always had the best understanding of the historical or moral or ideological ramifications of the wars they fought, or the moves they made. Meaning sometimes a great general, a great military leader could decide the best thing to do is to retreat under these conditions. But that doesn't necessarily take into consideration the educational meaning of that retreat, how that impacts the nation, the morale, the worldview, etc. So just as military leaders and as fighters, God is a very capable tribe. And they said they're going to go in the front under the leadership of Yoshua ben Nun, of course. Reuven as well. Right? Reuven and Gad will take the lead. Moshe ultimately agrees that they're going to have this land east of the Jordan, but that the tribe of Menashe will straddle the Jordan, and basically half of the tribe of Menashe will also be on the east bank. So, and that will maintain a connection. The fact that you have a tribe who is on both sides of the Jordan will create some kind of connection between the tribes on this side and the tribes on that side. And this is, of course, going to... there will be some problems that arise from this. And we should also understand what's the difference here between being on... If we're going to say it's all Eretz Yisrael, right? Is it all the land of Israel? What's west of the Jordan, what's east of the Jordan? Essentially, yes. It's all part of the promised land that Avraham is told about. Right? But in Parshat Mas'ei, when the borders are defined, it doesn't include all that. Meaning the borders are much smaller in Parshat Mas'ei than in Parshat Lech Lecha. So what's the difference? Why is the Torah giving us two different types of borders? There's Eretz Canaan, what we call Eretz Canaan, what we call Israel proper, the land between the river and the sea, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. That is really the internal land of Israel. We're supposed to conquer that first. That is where we live, where we have the Beit HaMikdash, where we really create our society. Land beyond that, that's still part of the promised land, that's still part of the land that Avraham was told would belong to his descendants, might be what we can call an international zone under Israeli sovereignty. Meaning a place for us to engage with other nations where we're in control, where we rule, but where it's not just, for us to live. I mean, it's possible for other peoples to also live between the river and the sea under the right conditions. But we're talking about something a little bit different here. We're talking about more of an international zone or a diplomatic zone. That's one understanding, that the land beyond the borders presented to us in Parshat Mas'ei is actually a part of Eretz Yisrael and should be part of Malchut Yisrael, the kingdom of Israel, but as a place where we're kind of conducting international relations. Now, the Torah also commands us, and this is a little bit difficult, that we're meant to dispossess the inhabitants of the land when we come in. Right? That's in Parshat Mas'ei. That we're meant to dispossess the nations that are in the land, the Canaanite nations. Okay? And it says we're supposed to drive them out, and it says that if we don't drive them out, they become pins in our eyes and thorns in our side. But there's a danger in not doing it. Now, the truth is, Yoshua ben Nun offered three options to the Canaanites. Either they can live in peace with us as Gerei Toshav, as righteous Gentiles, as Bnei Noach, living in our country, allied to us. That's option one. Option two is they leave. Option three is we kill them. We fight and we win. So when you have these three options presented, it's a little more complicated than just drive them out. But with many of the Canaanites, we had no choice but to actually kill them. But the question is whether or not this is the law for all time with any nation in our land. Right? That's an argument that's presented today when we talk about Palestinian issues. Right? There are people who say, well, look what the Torah says here. The Torah commands us to drive them out. We have to drive them out. But at the same time, we know that the Torah repeats over and over again that we're supposed to deal justly and kindly with the stranger in our land. Right? That there are non-Israelites who live amongst us that we're supposed to treat well. That we're supposed to behave justly towards. So, how do we resolve this ostensible contradiction? The Ramban actually does it. The Ramban, later on in his commentary on, it's in the book of Dvarim, I forget exactly where, basically makes a distinction between the nations we have to drive out or fight versus those we live with and treat properly. And it basically comes down to, according to the Ramban, whether or not they have an interest in sovereignty over our land. If a nation wants to rule parts of the land of Israel, if they want political sovereignty over parts of the land of Israel, we have to fight them. We have a mitzvah to liberate our land from foreign rule and to not let any of our land fall under foreign rule. All the land of Israel has to be under Israelite sovereignty. Now, at the same time, if there's a non-Israelite population or individuals that want to live here as our allies, like the Druzen, right, in peace with us, then we have obligations to treat them properly and to take responsibility for their welfare and to behave justly towards them. So, according to the Ramban, the distinction is whether or not they want sovereignty over our land. And in theory, as long as Palestinians aren't interested in a Palestinian nation state with sovereignty over our land, then we can work it out. Then we can find a way to live together. And the truth is, in my experience, most Palestinians aren't interested in a state. They're interested in equality in a single state, right? And maybe some care more than others over whether or not that state is called Israel or whether or not it's defined as a Jewish state, but a lot of that might really come down to their experience with what a Jewish state has meant in their experience for the last 100 years, or the last 75 years, or 76 years. But in theory, there could be a Jewish state that's Israel and allows them to experience full equality together with us here, right? That could exist. Now, there's also an idea that the problem with the Canaanites was idolatry. And the reason why the Canaanites had to be driven from the land one way or another was because the land of Israel is the place where some kind of spiritual message comes to the world, right? Like we broadcast a spiritual message to humanity from the land of Israel. So specifically, even though we obviously have an interest in there being no idolatry anywhere in the world, like idol worship is poisonous for humanity, and we want to eradicate it. But certainly we can't allow it to exist in the land of Israel, in the land that's meant to broadcast spiritual messages to the rest of humanity. So it's important to get rid of the Canaanite influence. Even if there's some Canaanites who fit the criteria to be able to stay and live with us, the Canaanite ideology. Remember, we understand the Canaanites as being the children of Ham, who conquered the land of Israel somewhere around the beginning of Parshat Lech Lecha, or just before, right? We're told that the Canaanite was then in the land, right? And that's understood, I think, by Rashi as they had just shown up, they had just conquered it. The terms Eretz Canaan and Eretz Yisrael were or Eretz Ivrim, rather. Eretz Canaan and Eretz Ivrim were interchangeable. The land of the Hebrews and the land of Canaan were the same place. And when Yosef is in prison in Egypt and he refers to the land as the land of the Hebrews, people know what he's talking about. And the fact that Avraham, or as Avram, was born outside the land of Israel, grew up outside the land of Israel, is an indication that they were refugees. They were refugees living somewhere else as a result of the Canaanite conquest of the land of the Hebrews. Right. So now this is, after the development of Am Yisrael, centuries of slavery in Egypt, 40 years in the desert, receiving the Torah, we come into the land of Israel to take it back from the Canaanites. And we have to make sure there's no idolatry in the entire land. And that's one of the things that the Torah is very clear about here, that regardless of whether or not it applies or doesn't apply to certain groups today, it certainly applied to the Canaanites then. either because they were interested in some kind of political sovereignty over our land, or because of idolatry, or maybe both. It's also important to note that the Canaanites were largely vassals of the Egyptian Empire. And one of the reasons why it was so important for Egypt to be decimated during the Exodus, the 10 plagues, then the destruction of their military at the sea, is because later in history, when we come and conquer the land of Israel, we don't want the Egyptians showing up on behalf of the Canaanites, on behalf of their Canaanite vassals. Now, one of the last things that Parshiot Matot and the book of ultimately the last thing before we're just told that these are the commandments that HaShem commanded through Moshe to Bnei Israel in the plains of Moav, right, the Jordan near Yericho. Right before that, we're told of this kind of issue regarding the daughters of Tzlofchad, right, that there's a problem. A lot of their tribesmen are afraid that if they inherit their father, which is what was already established in Parshat Pinḥas, that they're going to inherit the property of their father because he has no sons, right? Then could some of the tribal territory of Menashe end up in the hands of other tribes? So here you have this, it's very interesting how the Torah is balancing the needs of the individual with the needs of the collective. So temporarily there's going to be a law that women who inherit their father will only be able to marry inside their own tribe, so that the tribal lands don't end up being diminished, right? That each tribe has its territory. Later, one of the reasons we celebrate Tu B'Av is because it'll become permissible for women in that situation to marry outside their tribe. But here there needs to be this fail-safe mechanism to prevent the tribe of Menashe from losing land. Right? And that basically brings us to the end of Sefer Bamidbar, where we see the adventures of Israel developing in the wilderness over a 4-decade period. Right? We said in the first half there were a lot of crises that were very core to our internal development, and then in the second half of Parshat Bamidbar, what we've been learning is really more about what happens when Israel emerges from the desert after 40 years of hibernation and is now coming into contact with the other nations, other cultures. By the way, it's important to note that one of the big failures that we see at the end of Balak, beginning of Pinḥas, is this was the first time Israel really encountered other nations, right? After coming out of the desert, after receiving the Torah. And we failed. Our experience with the women of Moav and Midian was a failure. And it was very clear that Israel still required some internal rectification. That's one of the reasons for this war against Midian. And by the way, the war against Midian has very unique halachot. It's not the law in every war we fight to kill the women and the male children. Right? That's not always halakha. It was the law for that war, for a very specific reason. Because we had to, first of all, Moshe had to fix something inside himself through this war with Midian, and Israel had to fix something inside ourselves as well in this war with Midian, and we had to take a certain type of vengeance against Midian that would send a message and make others fear us. Chazak, chazak, v'yid chazak.